This will be a chance for us to connect the threads of everything that we've explored today. As we move into the discussion, let's please keep in mind 2 goals that we have. We want to connect the main ideas and insights from all the sessions today, and we want to reflect on their contemporary relevance and what these stories mean for us today. So we're going to begin by giving each speaker a few minutes. We'll say 2 minutes-ish, to briefly recap their talk and highlight any final thoughts you have, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for the last Q&A of the day. So let's begin with you, Janet.
Okay, so what I did in my talk was to talk about the overwhelming kind of campaigns that were used in conjunction with government and private industry in the first part of my talk to mobilize public support for World War II against a backdrop of pre-war division and the stakes, the high stakes of creating wartime morale. And in the second part of my talk, I talked about my research on sharks, and particularly in relation to the Office of Strategic Services multifaceted campaigns to boost morale among service personnel who encountered sharks in oceanic theaters of war. And so the shark becomes this kind of figure, a monster in a way, a repository of fear and anticipation, but also as a kind of testament, when people could swim through shark-infested waters, to extraordinary valor and courage. So I'm thinking of Charles Jack French and other folks who spent time in the water. And these experiences were so enormous in terms of their ubiquity that I believe that World War II really lays the foundation for the billion-plus-dollar shark culture industry that is a global phenomenon to this day. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to pick up monsters. I think monsters was a theme that has run throughout the day. But really, I research big figurative monsters. They're the big problem in the room often that you have to pay attention to because they are going to stamp on you. They don't care for you. And they're often of our making. And what I spoke about today really is about how these movies are a kind of litmus test. They are often a temperature check on attitudes, reflections, memories, or lack of memories to certain moments. And I mean, all movies do this in some regard. They always capture something about the moment in which they're made. But these movies, these giant monster movies, have a particular address to a very clear originating moment and subject. The war is the kind of big fuzzy reflection that runs through lots of them. The very specific moment of the Castle Bravo test in 1954 is a moment that it goes back to again and again and again and again, even to the point where the Apple series Legacy of Monsters, you've got Godzilla literally facing down that bomb. So it captures this moment and the feeling and sensibility, and that latest movie, -1, captures a return to a nostalgic nationalism in Japan, which has been growing, which will continue to grow. It's a film made by a filmmaker whose whole oeuvre seems to be about this kind of possibly a dream of an older Japan, however problematic that might be, or soft nostalgia, as it may be for the kind of economic miracle moment. But they always capture something in the same way that sharks are capturing a particular reflection, which we may get on to talk about. I've gone beyond my talk there. I've not really summarized. I've just got a theme going. So, Amber.
As the odd social scientist that's here, I started this morning by trying to talk about the kind of psychological and emotional underpinnings of a lot of messaging that happens in and around the war and themes, including things like monsters and sharks, but also including in-group, out-group dynamics, which is very powerful psychology, how primary emotions that are universal, like fear and anger, are easily tappable by people who practice persuasion and propaganda. And we talked about fear appeal propaganda and how it is weaponized in the war effort and in many places in order to spur behavior. And we talked about how fear appeal messages are composed of severity and susceptibility. There's a bad thing, and that bad thing can happen to me. And then also an efficacy statement of, and this is what you can do to avoid it. So the idea of fear is to motivate behavior, but you gotta be real careful with the fear, right? It's kind of like a Goldilocks, just right, because if you overfear, you get a freeze or an apathy response. You need that efficacy to motivate people. But we want to motivate people in an ethical way and not in a propagandic, these people are racist monsters that will stab you in the back, and kind of go with that out-group homogeneity effect of they-isms and they are all the same, which leads to racism and prejudice and discrimination and camps and bad things. So we kind of went through all of that, and we saw in the messaging the fear appeals of the angry, monstrous, long-teeth, bloody, knifed, backstabbing Japanese that are coming to get your children and your wives and your home and your values. And then we also saw cartoons and other propagandic messages of the Japanese are silly and they're stupid and they're gonna defeat themselves and they're just gonna bow to each other the whole time on the battlefield and you don't have to worry about them, and it will all be fine. So that balance of messaging and kind of the behaviors around the messaging that it was trying to lead to.
I'm Henry Sledge. I'm the son of Eugene Sledgehammer Sledge, who wrote With the Old Breed. I'm the author of the book, The Old Breed, The Complete Story Revealed, a father, a son, and how World War II and the Pacific shaped their lives.
I'm Rob Buscher, and I spoke earlier about the commonalities between the Yellow Peril Chinese exclusion era of anti-Chinese sentiment and how it sort of informs and shapes a lot of the images and even core ideas that are shaping anti-Japanese propaganda campaigns during World War II. From there, sort of transitioned into a discussion around the impacts that those campaigns had specifically on people of Japanese heritage who were living here in the United States, many of whom were citizens and were not treated as such. But then ending with this idea of ultimately film and Hollywood allows Japanese Americans to be reaccepted into this sort of cadre of loyal Americans through the narrative of service and sacrifice of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, as we see both in the post-war era and even with some of the newsreels that were produced during the war.
All right, well, we're going to open up you can ask a question to all of them on the panel or individual.
Rob, this is probably more appropriate for you, but I'm interested in your perspectives on how the Japanese treat the history of the Second World War today. I was in Nagasaki 6 or 7 years ago, and I was surprised to walk into the museum there, and there's a timeline with all sorts of photographs. It starts out, you know, early 30s or so in China, and you kind of have to look real hard to see this sort of bathroom tile picture of the Arizona burning, and oh yeah, we bombed the Americans, and then goes on. But then more shocking was to go into the museum store and see animated books that were pretty much addressed at kids, talking about, you know, U.S. invading certain islands and actually portraying in sort of comic book style U.S. Marines as these sort of thuggish brutes with blood dripping off their hands and innocent civilians. And you hear today how little Japanese people are taught in their education about what exactly went on in the war, and they get shocked when they leave the country for the first time. It almost seems like a form of, not propaganda, but certainly manipulation of the population of Japan to get the story straight from the Japanese perspective. And have you done any work on that side?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one. And again, to kind of make the distinction, This is sort of a departure from a lot of the population that I was talking about in my presentation specifically, but I have worked in U.S.-Japan relations. I'm a former staff member of the Japan-America Society of Greater Philadelphia, and I'm a member of the U.S.-Japan Council. So the aspect of post-war Japan and the Allied occupation of Japan, which often gets sort of glazed over in a lot of these post-war histories, is the role that the Supreme Command of Allied Powers, SCAP, had in essentially setting the curriculum within Japanese school and textbooks. And at the time, the wisdom was that the Japanese people needed to have the ability to recover from the wartime without being unnecessarily burdened by the atrocities that their military had committed. That was a conscious decision by American forces who were working under SCAP and the civilian information education to basically try and create a post-war Japan that would be pro-American and favored Western capitalism, in part to create a bulwark against the spread of communism in East Asia, particularly after the Communist Revolution of China in 1949. So it's a very nuanced issue that is taking place because at the time, they assumed that, like the Germans, Japanese would eventually have to come to terms with what they had done, right? That there would be some reckoning within the civil society. And unfortunately, that moment never came, because when the power is handed back over to the Japanese government in 1952, that moment never happens in terms of the education curriculum. And simply put, a lot of these atrocities were never covered in any real depth within the public education system in Japan. So it's a very real issue, and to your point, a lot of people who don't leave Japan, or perhaps do for the first time, are surprised when they begin learning the depth of these atrocities. So I think, I can't speak to the exact manga text that you're referring to because I'm not aware of it, but I think the culture of remembrance, and this was somewhat referenced in Steve's presentation, around the lack of meaningful reckoning or responsibility taking, and in the ways that culture allows the processing of guilt and trauma, there is this narrative of victimhood. And I think it's important to sort of parse it out in the same way that we can make a distinction between Japanese Americans and the military governments of Japan. I think we should also make an effort to differentiate between the civilians of Japan and the military personnel who are committing atrocities. Because again, as a fascist dictatorship, Imperial Japan was strictly censoring any information to its civilian public. Most Japanese citizens were unaware that they were losing the war until the firebombing campaigns began. And overwhelmingly, Japanese civilians welcomed the occupation because they saw it as an end to their suffering, the starvation, the military atrocities that were even being committed by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, against their own citizens on their soil. So there's much that needs to occur in order to have a full reckoning, and we can see there are many instances like the refusal or denial of history around certain things like the sexual slavery or comfort women, or other major atrocities that were committed by the Imperial Army. And ironically, some of the decisions during the occupation period are what at least set the foundation for that to occur. So I don't know what the solution is, but I do think that popular culture can potentially play a role in that.
So I actually have two questions. First one's for Henry. Do you have a project you're currently working on? And the second question is, you have all sat here, listened to all the presentations. Is there any question that any of you have for each other?
I do. Actually, my wife and I were in New York a couple of weeks ago. I met with my publisher. We were there for something else. And my publisher actually put an idea in my lap of another book he wants me to do. I don't really want to go. I've had conversations with key people on that. I don't want to say any more right now. And there have been some really great presentations. At the moment, I don't have a question I'm going to ask immediately.
I do have a question for you, if you don't mind. Yes. I have I have a psychology background. I have a vested interest in mental health and promoting mental health, and my husband's a veteran, as I've talked about. So is there something in your experience that you've read, you've talked to so many Marines, so many veterans, that you can, your father seemed to process his trauma in his own way, but in such a more constructive way. Is there something that you can maybe say to veterans or to people? I know military are usually a little bit antagonistic towards things like therapy, which I would encourage you. Therapy is good. But is there something you can speak to about that, of trying to help veterans process?
Speaking through the lens of my lane, my wheelhouse of being Sledgehammer's son, what he always told me was speaking to my grandfather, who was a very wise man, helped him a lot. Now, we talked about that earlier, so to try to stick to your question, to veterans, I would say, and the first thing I would say is I am not a veteran. I did not personally experience what they did. I don't want to pretend like I understand that. I say that humbly and respectfully. To try to cross that gap and still, because Marines connect with me. I love talking to Marines. Find something in your life that gives you joy. I don't care. Read a book. It's okay to drink alcohol. Do not let it rule your life. Alcohol is a good servant, but a bad master. As my grandfather said, it will make you play the fool. Make sure you control that. Perpetuate solid relationships with the loved ones in your life. If you have a bad day at work, you don't come home, as my dad used to tell me, you don't come home and kick the dog. You deal with that problem with that person at work. Don't take it out on the people and your pets or whatever who give you unconditional love. The things that give, if you like dogs, get a dog, spend time, go throw a tennis ball for that dog and take joy in watching him chase that ball and have the greatest day of his life. If you want to read, I don't care if you like restoring exhaust systems on Harley-Davidson motorcycles. I'm in the heavy equipment industry. I actually hear this a lot. Get a book and read, find something to occupy your mind constructively. For the Marines I know, they are hard-ass, highly trained professionals who do a very hard job. I can't even imagine what they go through, but I do connect with them on a visceral level, probably because of who my dad was. It's okay, you embrace that love of fellow Marines, but at a certain point, you retain that esprit de corps, love of the Marine Corps or the Army if that's your branch, but also be able to step back from that and spend time with your wife, your children, your husband, your children, whatever, and take in the joy that's there for you and don't shut it away. So that's just off the cuff. I don't know how else to answer that.
That was wonderful. Is there any more speakers that have questions for other speakers?
Rob, we talked the other day about what these movies meant to your family. Would you be willing to talk about that, the kind of diasporic experience of experiencing that?
Sure. So my family comes from Hiroshima, and two of my great-grandmother's cousins who she raised from childhood were killed in the bomb. One was on a school field trip visiting the center of the city that day. The other was a bank teller who was actually working in the A-bomb dome. So we have a very close and personal relationship to that particular narrative of the war. And I think, again, we need to be able to make this distinction between a civilian population and the military who is perpetuating these atrocities. And so, we heard a very eloquent presentation earlier from Rich Frank around how this larger encompassing narrative of the war. And I would just say, in terms of how it's been covered within cinema, Godzilla, I think, was something of a reclamation. My great-grandmother lived until I was in college. It was 2006 when she passed away. So I heard certain stories directly from her and other stories from my Obacha, my grandmother, and my mom. One of the stories that really sticks with me, when it was announced that Hiroshima was bombed, my family was already living in Utah. They had fled there to escape the wartime incarceration. And it sort of hit her like a ton of bricks, and she went into sort of a catatonic state for almost a month before she received word by telegram that most of her family had survived. Because in that moment, she believed that everyone she had known and loved was dead. And the sort of horrific nature of a weapon that can erase an entire city from existence, I think that's what we focus on, right? Not how it was deployed or the reasons why it may have been a good decision to do so, but more so on the inhumanity of a particular type of weapon. I think in that Gojira or Godzilla narrative, it does offer an opportunity for families who have this sort of direct connection to the wartime in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And it's also important to acknowledge that the vast majority of Japanese Americans living in the US mainland can trace our ancestry to Hiroshima, because this was the area that was the most impoverished and most directly affected by the famine. So many of our ancestors came here, and granted at a much earlier time. So maybe unlike my family, who has a more direct connection, it's an abstract concept. At the same time, sort of knowing and understanding the effect that it had within our direct family lineage, it has allowed me to appreciate a little bit more that in war there are really no victors, right? War is hell, and war causes terrible death and destruction. And ultimately, this is why we need to do our best to make sure that we do not repeat history and that we continue to have peace in our times.
Were there any more speaker questions to each other? Okay, we have a question right here.
I have a question, two questions actually for Dr. Ponivas. One, of the different types of media platforms available during World War II for propaganda, radio, print, posters, et cetera, was there one that was more effective than the others? And the second one, was there a particular message that was more effective when you look at everything from fear on one end to the benign ones like Grow Victory Gardens on the other end?
Really wonderful questions, and I think I will fail at answering them. As somebody who loves numbers and statistics, I haven't read a paper that has specific effect sizes for effectiveness from that era. The way they did media effect studies at that time is very different than the way that we do it now. However, the way that we understand media now, I would assume that the movies with the visceral moving photographs and the pictures and that kind of thing, especially in Succession, would probably have the bigger effect size if I was wanting to speak statistically. So because it hits you on multiple fronts. And when we talk about the media effects and persuasion, a lot of times people are a little more savvy when looking at the news or looking at things. They know that they're being sent a message. But a lot of times when we watch movies in particular, we kind of turn our brains off. And so it's not easier. It's a little bit easier to get messages through. People don't always realize that you have a message in your movie. So I think that is very powerful. There was at the time, the scientists were working on what we called like a hypodermic needle model or a direct effects model of media, because they were a little bit panicked about how powerful maybe movies could be. Well, now we function on what's called a more limited effects model. Media has effects, but it's not going to direct your behavior in a kind of direct cause and effect manner. But movies are still a very powerful medium. I think the radio would probably be second. But the most persuasive thing is the multiple platforms, right? It's everything, everywhere, and you're seeing it. So just the pervasiveness of the messaging and it being very consistent, that is where you get like the bigger punch, because it's inescapable. It's everywhere.
So this is the 80th anniversary in the Pacific War. What will we be talking about at the 100th, do you think? Maybe you all will be here. What do you think the topics will be? Change or same thing? Or
That's a great question.
I worry a lot about the fact that we're losing the last of our greatest generation, and that very soon we will have no living record of memory related to what happened during World War II. And I think everyone in this room and those watching online probably care about very similar issues, otherwise they wouldn't be doing this work. Ultimately, if we can find ways to preserve the memories of the people who experience these events directly, continue to teach them in ways that will be relevant and relatable to future generations, I'm hopeful that we can continue to preserve their memories and the lessons that this generation taught us.
I will fall in line with what Rob said. I mean, I hope 20 years from now that there are young people who still want to engage with that history. And I hope we continue to find positive ways for that to happen. I would always recommend, as I'm sure these academics would recommend, read a book. Video games are okay. We'll find, watching good movies or miniseries, that's a great thing, but, I think reading has to kind of be the core of it. But I just hope that there is a continued quest for interest in be it the Pacific War or the war in Europe, but just not lose a connection with this history. Just like Rob said, we are that greatest generation. I sat on a stage in New York 2 weeks ago at the Yale Club with 4 World War II veterans, all 102 years old. Well, 3 World War II veterans and a Holocaust survivor. And that was an amazing opportunity. I felt very honored to be a part of that. But it's really palpable. I mean, you can feel it slipping away. And so it's great that places like this exist and we do the things we're doing to keep interest and keep conversation.
Yeah, I want to just totally second everything y'all have said. Just thinking back to my childhood, World War II veterans were the parents of friends from large families, who had much older sisters and brothers. The real elders were the World War I veterans when I was a kid. And my parents had so many stories of wartime America, and it's, I'm 61 years old now, and I see that, generational turn as people die, and what does that do to our public memory? And thinking about a time of extraordinary mobilization. I mean, the size and scale of everything that happened. I mean, it's truly something we can never forget. And so my hope for the next 20 years is that we keep on it and we keep researching and remembering and doing the work, because otherwise it fades. And I think that's, 102 years old. It's incredible.
Can I add one thing? I don't want to interrupt either of you.
Go
really
for it.
quick, I just want to say this. There's probably hope here. We can be optimistic, and I say it because of this reason. I remember the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And I remember my dad saying, well, that's it, 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. It was a big deal. Now nobody's going to care. Everybody's going to forget.
I have a question over here.
Yeah, so I had a question about sourcing and also about the top-down dissemination of propaganda versus propaganda which might have generated kind of organically from the conflict and from stereotypes that were developed as cultures interacted with one another. I'm kind of fascinated by this concept of, I think it's the War Information Office, and this idea that people can kind of sit down in a room and essentially decide, this is the narrative, this is why you're fighting, and then create this film that's something like Why We Fight, that's, this very centralized core set of ideas. And I was just wondering, what are some of the major players you encountered looking at propaganda throughout the Pacific War? Did you see that it was mostly from the War Information Office? Was there a difference in the kind of propaganda and narratives that were produced depending on the person who was responsible for? I mean, is there any information available on how they might come to these kind of really decisive conclusions that obviously shape so much the narrative that was given in that day about why people were fighting and what they were doing, and then shaping that into the present day?
I'm going to just jump in really quickly because that's such a great question. One thing that immediately comes to mind is with the Voice of America, and potential unintended consequences of the Office of War Information kind of narratives that were being propagated. And so just as an example, when Voice of America was being played in India, India was in the midst of its own very, very strong independence movement. I mean, it achieves independence from Britain in 1947. And during the war, American programming is stressing freedom, self-determination. The Brits didn't like that so much. when it came to India or any other, Commonwealth country or colony, I mean, so that would be an example of intended messaging that an ally would take issue with.
I don't necessarily have an example from the Pacific War, more from a European British perspective, which is the films of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. Pressburger, who was a Hungarian emigre, Powell, who was a visionary British filmmaker, and they made a number of films sanctioned by the Ministry of Information. One was The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, at a time where the Allies were doing poorly, and they were vilified for it. The film is all about a need for a new kind of war. The Germans fighting dirty, and needing to fight the war differently. And they were vilified for it. And they were also vilified for a later film, Matter of Life and Death, which is Stairway to Heaven here, which is all about the special relationship. And again, they're criticized for it. So attempts to make propaganda films didn't always land, and could be the absolute opposite effect. But they leave us with really terrific records of how we were fighting an information war as well as a combat war.
I wanted to say too, I don't have a direct answer to your sources problem, but the real power, a lot of the influence that comes from media or propaganda or kind of media effects comes from the ability to set the norm. And we know from persuasion science that when it comes to norms, and by norms I mean what is everybody else doing and what is everybody else saying, we follow that, especially in times of uncertainty, especially in times of fear. What's going on? I guess I'll do what they're doing. So a lot of the behavioral constraints come from that normative power. And one of the big powers of media is to set that norm. And so even if a propaganda campaign isn't necessarily effective on me, if it's effective on my neighbor, then they're the ones telling me oh, you can't trust those Japanese, or you can't do this or can't do that. I may not believe the campaign, but I might listen to my neighbor. Because interpersonal is still the most compelling way to persuade somebody. I know we've been talking about media all day, but persuasion still fundamentally happens in an interpersonal context, and that's the ability to set the norm. And that's the great power to be both positive and negative. So we talked earlier about accuracy of portrayals and things like that. That's why it's so important to be accurate in your messaging and not rely on stereotypes, because if we're relying on stereotypes, I'm saying that that's what's real, right? That's what's normal. And if people make bad jokes and they're racist and everybody laughs, then that's okay, and now we're all okay with it, and now we're laughing and we're all racist and it's fine. Of course, it's not fine, right? But that is also the great power of media, to be positive. I can set the norm. So if the messages I'm sending out are not stereotypes and they're based in facts, and it's, oh, here's my neighbor and they happen to be Asian, and then I watch that TV show and an Asian family moves next to me, it's like, oh, well, they're okay. I watched that show with the Asians and they're amazing. And now we're spreading peace and love and norm, right? Because it's all about the precedent that you set, right? It's about that normative influence. So TV has a way, media has a way of reflecting reality, but it can also create reality, and it has a way of really setting that normative behavior. So when campaigns kind of go awry, or the reason that they're so pervasive is because if you can get to that interpersonal person that's going to speak your message for you, that's really going to be powerful. But it can be powerful in both directions, right? There's a real power in pop culture to be positive as well. We're going to talk, we've been talking all day about how negative it is, but I did want to say pop culture is really important, and it's very important not only for the historical memory we were talking about, because nobody is going to keep caring about this unless they have something cool to watch. I teach students every day, and until I show a video clip, they don't pay attention, right? So we need pop culture, we need media, but we need it to be good, we need it to be accurate, we need it to be real, and it can do positive things as well as negative things. Sorry if that derailed. I got a soapbox.
I'll share a brief example related to the Japanese Americans and both kind of the narrative around the War Relocation Authority camps. Again, the OWI is working with the WRA to try to basically euphemistically explain what this is, give the American people context for it, but then also in doing so, sort of counter some of the overseas propaganda that is largely coming from the European front. So like Nazis and Italian fascists, to a lesser extent, but the Nazis certainly are picking up on what's happening, and they're not ones to talk, obviously, because of their own concentration camps. But at the same time, this is going to be a talking point in the Cold War era that the Soviet Union will time and time again bring up about the mistreatment of racial minorities in the United States. So to kind of get ahead of that, in a certain way, we have the sort of tension around the double victory, victory at home and abroad, that's being talked about in many of the African-American newspapers. To a lesser, limited extent, that is also what Japanese Americans are sort of understanding their role in this conflict. But it sort of comes about largely because of the lobbying efforts of the Japanese American Citizens League. And Mike Masaoka, who was the executive director at that time period, he's only 27 years old. He had grown up in Salt Lake City, Utah. He himself and his family were not subjected to the forced removal, and he wasn't super plugged into the larger Japanese American community. Yet, at this time of crisis, he's sort of elevated as the national spokesperson for the entire community. And I think ultimately, rightly so, he did have this idea that, you know, if Japanese Americans can prove themselves in combat, that they could reclaim this narrative that, yes, in fact, Japanese Americans are just as loyal as any other person, right? We don't see German and Italian Americans being rounded up in the same numbers as the Japanese Americans were. There's a limited number of German and Italian nationals who were, but not on the scale of the entire ethnicity of Japanese folks living on the West Coast. So in this kind of moment of great uncertainty, there's this test of honor, and ultimately Japanese Americans pay the blood tax and are accepted as Americans. And this continues to be kind of propagated both through the newsreels that we talked about earlier, with the unintended consequence of, unfortunately, really pitting the Japanese American community against itself. And so despite the ultimate positive outcomes for Japanese Americans being then elected into office, many of the first Congress people and senators were veterans of the 442 who were of Japanese ancestry, and it was sort of on that platform of service and sacrifice that they're able to win their election campaigns, and ultimately, decades later, are sort of contributing towards this effort for the redress movement. But one of the other interesting footnotes, there's a lot of troop mixing that's happening during the occupation, the GI war brides, right? And this is particularly prevalent in the Japanese context. At the time, you know, over 30 states in the United States had anti-miscegenation laws. It was illegal for people of different races to marry. And this was a big problem for the military because, and I'll just say this, I think the military has actually historically been an anti-racist organization. It was ultimately, you know, President Truman who agrees to desegregate the military by executive order, right? And in part because these brothers in arms are coming home from the war, and they're going to places like Camp Shelby, and they're being told that they can't go to the same bars, they can't sleep in the same rooms, and that's not something that the soldiers would stand for at that point. So there's this sort of larger view, right, into the future, but bringing it back to film, 1952, there's a film called Japanese War Bride, starring Shirley Yamaguchi, who was actually a renowned Japanese propaganda starlet from the Manchukuo Eiga Kaisha. So this was the Manchurian Film Corporation, and for about 15 years, she had actually been starring in anti-Chinese, pro-imperial Japanese propaganda films. She had grown up in Manchukuo, the puppet state of Imperial Japan, and so she spoke Mandarin Chinese with a native accent. Many people thought she was Chinese. And she would often be paired with a Japanese man, and they'd have this sort of romantic story where she initially rejects his advances, and then they come together because he proves himself to be honorable and having the best intentions. So like an enactment of the imperial power dynamics, right, that Japan is trying to project to its colonial state. Very interesting that she then comes to Hollywood in the post-war era, marries an American Hollywood producer, and then stars in this particular film under the pseudonym Shirley Yamaguchi. So if you have a chance, 1952, Japanese War Bride.
Just one more thing, too. Thank you for that. That was fascinating.
I'm very interested in historical strange bedfellows, too, in terms of thinking about this period and others. And one of those strange bedfellows moments comes towards the end of the war when a group of OSS agents, linguistic specialists, parachute down into Vietnam, and they partner with Ho Chi Minh, OSS agent number 19, General Giap, and others, you know, as an anti-Japanese strategic move. The war is soon over, but of course we know the rest of the story, that Ho Chi Minh and his, you know, comrades, they ultimately become our enemy. But it's one of those kind of moments of something different, but quickly turns in a different direction with, you know, the oncoming Cold War that comes right after World War II. And of course, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French pull out, the US begins very slowly coming to Vietnam. And the rest is part of our history.
Give them all a round of applause.